You know, suppose if Al-Qaeda says, I think the United States should remove itself from Iraq, and you believe that's also a wise thing, are you now affiliated philosophically with Al-Qaeda? You're an enemy combatant. You're providing them moral support. Right? Lock you up forever. No habeas corpus, nothing. You're so dangerous here. You're questioning the president's infallibility about how to run the Iraq war. What kind of audacity is that when we have a king? Lèse-majesté. Now, let's think about, he's used this idea of an unlawful enemy combatant. Against how many citizens? He says, oh, important to defeat international terrorists. Well, 3. In 7 years, 3. Now, one was a Mr. Hamdi, who we then sent back to Saudi Arabia. He's a U.S. citizen. Now he's out free there. He didn't even prosecute him. But again, he was a critical component of the omnipresent danger of establishing a caliphate in Washington, D.C. if we're not alert to this danger. Now, listen, it's unfortunate. I'm not making up these metaphors and characters. That's what I confront every day. Congress, talking to these people, there'll be a caliphate there tomorrow, Mr. Fine. That's what they say their objective is. You know? Said, yeah, anybody can state an objective, you know, on top of Mount Everest or whatever. The question is it lunatic or is it feasible? Then there's the second enemy combatant was Jose Padilla. But when it got close to requiring them to prove that he was fell within the definition of enemy combatant, they changed it. Said, no, now you're no longer an enemy combatant. We'll indict you and prosecute you. Then the third enemy combatant is a Mr. El-Masri. His case is still plunging around into the courts of appeals. But there you have it, ladies. Those are the dangers that the president had to address with this very odd and dangerous idea of an enemy combatant in order to protect us from another 9/11. 3 times in 7 years. Now, what are the consequences of being an enemy combatant? Well, the president said, because I never make a mistake. And remember, he told us in that debate with John Kerry, he just never makes mistakes. It was a gift that God gave him. And he checked it a second time, and God reassured him. Even though he acknowledged he doesn't learn by reading, but we'll put that aside. That just makes it even more remarkable. Well, if the president thinks he believes you're an enemy combatant, then he can seize you and send you to Guantanamo Bay or a brig. Now, how long? Well, really, forever, because it's until the war against terrorism is over, which is never. And, well, what are your opportunities to prove that you're innocent? You're not an enemy combatant. Well, basically none. You can go before what's called a combatant status review tribunal, which presumes under its rules that the government is correct. And of course, you don't get to actually know why the government thinks you're an enemy combatant. It's really quite surrealistic, Kafkaesque is perhaps the best word, to read some of the transcripts of these combatant status review tribunal proceedings. The defendant or the accused says, well, why do you think that I'm an adherent to Al-Qaeda? I was performing construction work in Afghanistan. We can't tell you that. Why is it that you're not? Well, I need to know what the evidence is. Well, that's all classified. We can't tell you. Of course, you don't have a right to counsel either. And that's why, and you don't have a right to access, seeking habeas corpus and have an independent judge ascertain whether or not there indeed is evidence that makes you an unlawful enemy combatant, aside from the difficulty of knowing what that means anyway, a philosophical enemy combatant or what have you. Now, if you take a nation like Israel, which confronts a far more serious threat of terrorism, their idea of an unlawful enemy combatant is much narrower, namely someone who's engaged in active hostilities against the United States, or brigaded in that sense, providing weapons or otherwise. And that's a country who really does have day-to-day confrontation with terrorism. Say, life and law is matters of degree and balance. It's adjusting it to what is genuine, not as what is contrived in order to create executive branch power. Now let me get to another area of law, which I want to address because it transcends just the Bush and Cheney usurpations, but why it shows how sinister, in my judgment, the current political culture is with regard to ever retaining our republic and not slowly degenerating into pure executive despotism. We're most of the way there already as a matter of our thinking. And this is the authority to initiate warfare on the president's own initiative. Now, there are some provisions of the Constitution that are blurry. They're chiaroscuro, if you will. And others are crystal clear as what the Founding Fathers intended. And when it came to deciding which branch of government had a power to initiate warfare, not respond to a Pearl Harbor, but initiate warfare, there was a uniform view. It was the Congress. Madison, James Wilson, everyone at the convention kept saying, we do not want one person to rush us into war, or even a group of people. That Congress was the one to decide whether or not to initiate warfare. And the reasons weren't simply abstract, they weren't academic. There's a couple reasons. Number one, remember to change from a condition of peace to a condition of war is to change to circumstances where killing is made legal. That's the earmark of war. It's legal to kill people. That doesn't mean it can never be done, but it means you ought to be rather careful about the circumstances in which you cross that Rubicon. Now, the second reason the Founding Fathers wanted to entrust to the Congress the authority to decide whether to initiate warfare was their worry that the executive branch historically had invariably contrived dangers, had initiated warfare to do what? Aggrandize itself. Money, the ability to offer rewards to friends like Blackwater or Halliburton, to promote people, patronage, the desire for fame, the desire to contrive a popularity under the banner of patriotism, what Sam Johnson described as the last refuge of a scoundrel when it's used in a manipulative fashion. And they were not writing on a blank slate. The Founding Fathers were quite aware of the history of politics and warfare, going back to the Athenian times. And they understood the executive branch repeatedly would run off to war and end up using the excuse of war to encroach and ultimately destroy liberties. Indeed, that was how the Roman Republic fell. In various crises, the Senate would create dictatorial powers and hand them over to Scipio Africanus and others who would save them. And pretty soon, the dictatorial powers stopped being handed back. Again, it's because, remember, ladies and gentlemen, people in power, especially the White House, they are not like George Washington. And the Founding Fathers kept saying that. Washington is a prodigy. He was someone who could have been king during the Revolutionary War, said, I don't want it. He said, we have to assume these will be people like James II, King George, Charles I, and we need to guard against this deformity of character that craves power and domination for its own sake. And they saw the history of empires crumbling for needless wars. The British, later on, Afghan wars, Boers in Burma. Why? For prestige. Thucydides has written back the Peloponnesian Wars that any power that enables a nation to exert itself over another will be utilized unless checked. That's the nature of the beast of people who cling to the reins of executive power. And we cannot exempt ourselves from that flaw. Indeed, Edmund Burke, the virtual gospel for conservatives, as late as 1798 saying, what I fear is that British power will come to be dreaded. And what I fear is that we will think we are not like other men, and we will not abuse our power and military authority unless it's checked. That's Edmund Burke. Every syllable I've uttered is the most conservative syllable that you can find out of philosophers of politics. The things that Bush is promulgating are utopian. Trust me, we're good people. We know it all. We're infallible.